the Civil War, a Union encampment atop the Cumberland Mountains in southern Tennessee was the site of a horrific explosion. Half a dozen men were accidentally burned alive, leaving only 2 known survivors. Using a combination of historic records, letters, recreations, and interviews with family members, we will explore this long-forgotten event and the inspiring life of one of the survivors, Samuel Mitchell. Family historian Randall first heard Samuel's story at the age of 15 when he began a year-long genealogy project for a history class in school. His initial interest quickly grew into a lifelong obsession.
Everything about this man fascinated me. I was intrigued, and I couldn't research enough. I couldn't get enough of this information.
During his quest for answers, Randall made a breakthrough when he found and contacted Samuel's granddaughter, Luella Mitchell Brewer. Luella was eager to share her childhood memories of her grandfather and answered many questions about Samuel, whom she called Grandpap. Although Luella has since passed away, one of her daughters continues her mother's tradition of sharing Samuel's story.
Well, I heard the stories from my grandparents, from my grandfather and my grandmother, and from my aunts and my mother. I grew up hearing these stories. I started as a young child hearing them. I had asthma, and I couldn't leave out of the house for days at a time. Sometimes 2 weeks. And I would hear the stories, and I'd ask questions. And I loved them. I wish I'd asked more.
Samuel Mitchell was born on November 9, 1840, in Montgomery County, Kentucky. By 1860, he had moved to Nicholas County, where he lived and worked on his uncle's farm in a little community called Pleasant Valley.
Nicholas County, Kentucky is a beautiful, picturesque area. It's rolling hills and deep valleys and lots of streams. It's absolutely beautiful. When I visited that area of Kentucky earlier this year, I just was fascinated by how beautiful this area was.
The first details about Samuel emerge from the National Archives, where soldiers' records are preserved.
He is described in his military record as being about 6 foot in height. He had dark hair, fair blue or gray eyes, and probably about the build that I would have been when I was younger and skinnier, so about 160 pounds. We don't really know that much about his early life or his childhood. We've never been able to really confirm who his parents were, because I think some of that has been lost with time.
Samuel's story might also have been lost with time had it not been for the life-changing events that would occur as his home state of Kentucky was pulled into the Civil War. When hostilities broke out in the spring of 1861, Kentucky, a border state, attempted to remain neutral. Initially, it seemed that both the Union and the Confederacy would respect this neutrality, although each tried to influence the state to choose one side or the other. In an attempt to influence Kentucky's position, the state was invaded and occupied by Confederate troops. Kentucky's governor, Beriah Magoffin, was sympathetic to the South and refused to order the rebels to leave the state. State legislators passed a bill instructing the governor to order them to leave and to enlist 40,000 troops to protect the state. The governor vetoed the measure. On September 25, 1861, the legislature overrode his veto, and Kentucky's men were quick to answer the call to arms.
My great-great-grandfather was one of the men who enlisted the very day that became law. He enlisted in the 18th Kentucky Volunteers, part of Company H. His enlistment was for 3 years. At the time that Samuel enlisted, he was getting paid $13 a month from the state of Kentucky. I don't know that he necessarily was, against slavery or the issue of that, as much as maybe he and other Kentuckians were against someone trying to tell them what to do. And so when, the Confederacy invaded the state, I think that may have just been a call to arms for him and some of his family members, that they weren't going to allow someone else to invade their state and try to tell them what to do. I don't think Samuel had any idea what the war would hold for him. I think that probably his attitude was much like what the attitude was of other soldiers. After a battle or two, the other side would capitulate and it would be over with. And that couldn't have been any further from the truth.
The early role of the 18th Kentucky Infantry was relatively uneventful, only having seen fighting briefly in a skirmish at Cynthiana, Kentucky. There were, however, endless rounds of roll calls, meals, drills, inspections, and duties. To try to break the monotony of this routine, soldiers like Samuel Mitchell found other ways to pass the time.
They did what they could to entertain themselves. There was social drinking. They would smoke tobacco, play cards, play dominoes. They had musicians that would belong to different companies, and they would go around and entertain the troops. They looked forward to the letters from home. It was really their only link to life back home. They didn't have telephones, so they couldn't call people. They spent a lot of time praying too, because they didn't know what kind of situation that they might get into next.
The relative monotony of their routine was interrupted when Samuel and the 18th Kentucky Infantry were called into action at the Battle of Richmond, Kentucky. Late in the summer of 1862, Confederate General Kirby Smith moved 21,000 battle-seasoned soldiers out of Knoxville, Tennessee, and headed toward Richmond, Kentucky, where he intended to take control of the state. Opposing Smith's advance is Union General Bull Nelson. Less experienced Northern troops and their attempt to stop the advancing Confederate army were overwhelmed. Newspaper accounts published at the time stated that Union troops were routed and completely demoralized. When fighting ended on August 30th, 1862, some 2,000 Union troops had been captured, and many more killed or wounded. Private Samuel Mitchell was shot and then briefly taken prisoner of war.
My great-great-grandfather was shot in the left leg, and he had a double compound fracture of that leg. This was a very, very serious injury. Even today, that would be a serious injury because the bone is broken and it's broken through the skin.
Gunshot wounds in that era were using those musket balls, which were a lot larger than a gunshot that we would see today. And in those days, antibiotics were unheard of. The bleeding would have been severe.
They'd hold him down every morning, take a shell handkerchief and run through there and swab that out. He said that was death and destruction. They had to hold him. They didn't have no anesthetic and nothing to do around then.
Samuel would likely have been taken to the nearby Mount Zion Christian Church, which had been hastily set up as a field hospital for Union soldiers. There, he would have witnessed one horrific scene after another. Wounded soldiers were laid out on church pews, where some carved their initials into the wood before they died, waiting to be treated. In a nearby corner of the church, Surgeons feverishly amputated mangled body parts and tossed these out of the window. By the end of the day, so many body parts had been discarded that it is said they reached the height of the windowsill.
After they were paroled, if you will, from being prisoners of war by the Southern soldiers, they oftentimes were taken into the people's houses who lived in that area, and they cared for them. And I realize that sounds weird because they were supposed to be enemies of each other.
The women did not see it that way. They took care of the wounded, whichever they were, Confederate or Union. And they had a lot of it was Shakers. The Shakers went and took care of the wounded. And I grew up hearing about the Shakers and what they did, the humane things that they did for the soldiers.
Other than a slight limp that would persist for the rest of his life, Samuel made a full recovery and returned to active duty within 6 months. During the spring and summer of 1863, the Union Army participated in a campaign to seize Tennessee from Confederate control. By late July, rebel forces had been pushed back to Chattanooga, and Union troops began a long march over the Cumberland Mountains in pursuit of the enemy. Marching with the Union Army is 22-year-old Samuel Mitchell. His trip up the mountain was complicated by more than his limp. The roads were poor and often muddy, and weather conditions severe.
There are reports of there being very severe storms. At one point, one soldier described, he said that the afternoon sky turned as black as a stack of cats.
Arriving on top the mountain, they set up camp at University Place, known to us today as Sewanee, and waited for orders to march onward to Chattanooga. On Saturday, August 8, 1863, Private Samuel Mitchell was assigned to help the 21st Indiana Artillery inspect their ammunition, which had been damaged by recent storms. Great-great-grandson Randall Riley spent years trying to unravel the story of what happened next.
I obsessed for a number of years about what happened with this explosion because unfortunately, there was no one single complete accounting of what had taken place on August the 8th, 1863. So I spent a lot of time trying to solve this mystery. And in the process of digging further and trying to research this, what I have uncovered is that there are even discrepancies from my own great-great-grandfather.
Then, after more than 20 years of research, a chance discovery of a book written in 1892 provided a complete accounting of the chain of events that would change Samuel's life forever.
During our encampment at the University Place, a sad and deplorable accident happened to the 21st Indiana Battery, attached to the 3rd Brigade of our division. By reason of the continuous rains prior to our removal here, the powder of the battery had gotten wet, and the captain had ordered it spread out to dry upon tarps laid on the ground. One of the members of the battery, in the act of passing a revolver to another member, let the weapon fall from his hand, which struck the cap of a percussion shell. The shell burst and ignited the powder spread upon the ground. The flame, like a flash, leaped to the caissons and limbers filled with ammunition. It caused a most terrific explosion, wounding half a dozen battery men, 4 of whom died of their injuries. Sergeant David Biddle Floyd, History of the 75th Regiment of Indiana Infantry Volunteers.
Men were burned horrifically. Eyebrows were singed off, eyelashes were singed off, the hair on the top of their head was burned to a crisp, and of course their skin, wherever it was exposed, would have been blistered and burned, I'm sure in some cases directly to the bone. In my great-great-grandfather's case, his right arm was burned so severely that he had what they called ankylosis, which is a turning back of the fingers. He couldn't use his little finger, his ring finger, and partially the middle finger as well. His hand was turned under like this for the rest of his life from that point forward because of the burns that he sustained on the underside of his arm.
He probably protected his eyes because his eyes were not injured during this event. But what was injured was both of his ears. They did document that he essentially had no cartilage left. He had no ears left. His right ear seemed to be the most affected. In the healing process through the years, as that started healing, he started getting scarring, not only on the outer part of the ear, but also in the inner part in the canal. There was so much scarring in that area that they actually documented that he couldn't hear more than a foot away. The ear itself, because of the scarring on the outer part, caused so much scarring that it shrunk to about 1/16 of an inch, which is about 2 millimeters, which is no bigger than a pin size. When he protected his eyes, it caused the nose to not be protected. So there was almost a star scarring to his nose area. On the lower part of the right side of the ribs, there was approximately a 7 by 2 inch scar that developed. So imagine a diameter of a soccer ball in a scar that developed on the right side because of these wounds. Nowadays, we actually have a physician who gets trained on how to better manage pain, not only with the shorter acting medications that we use IV-wise initially when the patient needs more care, but then slowly start titrating these IV medications and use more oral so when the patient does go home, they will be able to manage their pain better. Back then, there was morphine, there was laudanum, which was oral. I could only imagine how fast that would work or how often they would have to take that medication. A patient nowadays would be given quite a bit of pain medication, especially when they're doing wound care, because it's not unheard of to have patients pass out with a severe pain that probably happened.
He was sent down the mountain to a place called Cowan, Tennessee, where they had set up a field hospital there. And he stayed there for quite some time until he was well enough that they shipped him by train back to Nashville, and he was cared for there in Nashville at a military hospital.
And my grandmother told me that he was injured so bad and he couldn't eat, and a lady carried him a sweet potato. And he put it in the window, and he'd just pinch a bite off of it at the time, just a little pinch. And eventually he ate the potato.
We would probably think that he had to overcome a lot of scrutiny from others that were around him as far as his physical appearance. So what that would do to your thought on how he probably on a daily basis had to be reminded by others that he had these injuries, that he survived these injuries, but they were very apparent.
So what he did, I was told by his grandchildren, was he grew his hair longer and he wore it just below where the earlobes would have been. And I think when he was younger, it probably was a reasonable disguise for him. I think it probably did what it was supposed to do. If you put a hat on and he's wearing the hair like that, you probably, if you weren't looking for it and if you weren't paying attention, you probably didn't notice it. As he got older and his hair got thinner, or if he didn't have a hat on, I expected it was probably pretty noticeable.
He spent many months recovering from the physical injuries he suffered at Sewanee. and after rejoining his regiment, he received a medical discharge on July 14, 1864, while he was stationed at Ringgold, Georgia. Unable to sustain a living and facing an uncertain life, he filed for a disability pension.
His records indicate that he was physically unable to earn a living as a farmer because his vocation was as a farmer, and especially with the injury to his right arm, initially he was completely unable to do any kind of farm work. In Civil War days, they looked at giving a pension based on how much injury there was to a person. For example, if you were missing a leg, you might rate $12 a month. If you only had severe injury to a limb, you might only rate $8 a month. In my great-great-grandfather's case, because he still retained his limbs, but he just had these injuries that limited his ability to care for himself or to earn a living, he rated it about $8 per month.
While the government had established ways to provide financial support for those who were physically disabled by their wartime service, few, if any, provisions were made to help deal with the emotional impact of the war. Although Samuel's service and pension records contain nearly 100 pages of documents, only one sentence reported the status of his mental health.
Of course, when anybody comes back from a war, even if they don't have physical injuries, there is always an impact of what you've seen in front of you. Back in those days, they saved your life, and the rest was up to you.
Although Samuel would always live in the shadow of Sewanee, the picture that emerges after the war is that of a family man. In about 1869, he met and married a young woman named Anna Hopkins.
They began their life together just north of Carlisle at a little place called Pleasant Valley.
They say that when they married, they had no place to live. They married and they took his army gear and went to a tent and lived in the woods a little while. They made a bed of his army overcoat in the woods at the tent, and that's where they started off, and they just moved on from there.
He was, from all that we have gathered, very much in love with her, and she was a beautiful woman from his descriptions, and a good cook.
And she had black curly hair and dark eyes. It was olive complexion.
Anna came from a large family. We think Samuel came from a large family. Subsequently, they also had a large family.
Samuel's children, who called him Pap, passed the stories they heard about their parents down by word of mouth to their families. His grandchildren continued this tradition, and some of these stories about their grandpap have been preserved in the letters they wrote to each other. Great-great-grandson Randall Riley describes how his initial interest was sparked by what he read in one of those letters.
The first story that I ever heard about him was that he had killed his wife. And apparently what had happened, my grandfather and his cousin, his first cousin, were having a conversation in the living room one day. My grandmother was in the kitchen and overheard this story. And I think, bless her heart, she had some trouble hearing. So I think that that's where the story kind of got skewed a little bit.
He told Clint sitting in this living room, I heard every word. He said, Clint, seems we had some real bad kinfolks. Clint said, how come? He said, seems Pat Mitchell pushed his wife downstairs and killed her. Winnie Riley, wife of grandson Clint.
My understanding from having a different version of the story is that apparently my great-great-grandfather's uncle was an unsavory character. And what we understand may have happened is that he either made a pass or did something towards my great-grandmother, Anna. Samuel was not happy about this at all, so he shot him. Now, he did not kill him, because I found this man on census records, and he was very much alive. So it didn't kill him. But, you know, even in those days, if you shot someone, you were still subject to the law. So I think that because of this incident, they left Kentucky altogether.
The Mitchells moved to Texas in about 1875 and settled in Brown County. Samuel said, "When I came to Texas, it was a new, wild country." The Mitchell family would face the many hardships that came with living on the edge of the frontier, including horse thieves and severe, prolonged droughts that encouraged lawlessness. Also, because of the circumstances in which they left Kentucky, and because he was now a northerner deep within the Old South, Samuel let his pension lapse, and this source of income that had provided some security was now gone.
They had to plan as much as they could. I know that my grandmother told me that, you know, back in those days, even when she was a child, that they grew everything that they possibly could. They planted gardens. They, would dry their own fruit. They would can. They would do everything that they possibly could to plan for as long ahead as they would be able to. But I know that there probably were times that they were very hungry. One of the stories is that this family survived one summer on only parched corn, grasshoppers, and pecans. And that was a hard life.
In spite of his family's courageous efforts, it is believed they were ultimately driven from the area by the harsh living conditions they faced. The Mitchell family moved out of Brown County to Alvarado in Johnson County in 1888. They had been in Alvarado about a year when Anna died in childbirth. Their youngest daughter, Lola, was only 3 years old when her mother died, but the memory of that day was unforgettable. She described what she saw that day to her daughter, Mildred, who then shared the story with her niece, Elaine Woodley.
Aunt Millie told me something I had never heard before. She said Lola told her once that the only memory she had of her mother was that Annie was laying in bed and blood was dripping, running all over the floor. Of course, Annie went on to say, yeah, bleeding internally. Elaine Woodley, great-granddaughter, June 25, 1985.
Of course, she was a very small girl, but Mother remembers her mother dying and something about the cemetery where she was buried. Grandma is supposed to have been buried in a metallic coffin that would never rust. Melvin William Smith, grandson, 1966.
It was cold, it was in the wintertime, and he dug a grave the best he could. He put rocks on her grave to keep animals from bothering it.
My great-great-grandfather, even though he was had all these injuries, the story is that when she died, he wrapped her and the baby in a quilt, and that he placed them in a metallic casket. I think that this is testament to how much he cared for her. Those metallic caskets in those days would have cost an enormous amount of money. I mean, this would have been months and months worth of money for him to have found to bury them in a casket. A lot of people were buried in pine boxes, if that, back in those days. But he never remarried. And you have to keep in mind, too, that back in those days there were no daycares. You didn't have babysitters or anything like that. Occasionally you might have a neighbor who could watch the kids if something really terrible happened. But he had no relatives in this area that we are aware of either, so he really was on his own. and he elected to take care of his family, raise his family on his own. He never married again.
Shortly after his wife's death, Samuel packed his belongings and moved his family to Stephenville in Erath County.
When they first moved to Stephenville, they lived in a half dugout. Now, a half dugout is sort of like a sod house, so it literally was halfway dug out into the side of some kind of a hill or a mountain, and that's the kind of living environment that they had.
Samuel was a single parent now, and he did what he had to do to support his large family.
They say of him, he'd walk 10 to 20 miles a day, clear brush, and all he had to eat was a pone of cornbread and a hunk of fatback. He carried an old tin coffee pot, an old black frying pan, took this fat meat and cornbread in a gunny sack, known to us as a toe sack, and hang it on a limb to keep the ants out of it. But you know dang well it had that old toe sack lint and fiber in it. Lesser of two evils, I guess. Put that old coffee pot on coals where he burned the brush he cut, and drink black coffee all day long. Now, if you could tell the truth and say it, he surely lived the life of Lazarus in the Bible. Winnie Riley, wife of grandson Clint.
I do know Uncle Hilly was deathly afraid, when young, of his daddy. I remember him saying that Pap would have a job chopping wood somewhere, and he'd leave the older ones in charge of the little ones and tell them they'd best be okay when he came back. He also told one time of running off, why, I don't remember, and hiding out with some distant neighbors. He would say that he was a mean man. Elaine Woodley, great-granddaughter.
I think it was rather hard, but he took care of them and taught them everything, I guess, that he knew and everything that he could. And they were a loving family. You could tell he really cared for them, the stories they told. And he was rather strict. But you would have to be if you raised those children alone. The older girls had to take care of the younger ones and help with the housework.
You also talked about how they handled bath time.
That is, he took the boys to the creek and left the girls at the house with the wash tub to take their baths in front of the fireplace in the wintertime. Winter and summer, they went to the creek. The boys went to the creek to bathe. He went with them. That's where all of them bathed. But the girls were protected. They were in the house.
You were telling us a story a minute ago about him teaching the girls how to quilt.
Yes, he did. He cut little round circles out of leather and punched holes in them. And he put the frames up and put his batting, and he just put material, the lining and the top were just pieces of material. And they tacked through those washers. It'd be like putting two buttons together and tied them. And that was how they made their quilts. Now, he must have been a special person to think of all of that stuff and teach those girls.
Do you think that he perhaps taught his children a lot because none of them were educated in school? Or at least the first part of them were not. My grandfather never learned to read and write. Mm-hmm. But they all were so darn smart. He had to have taught something.
Well, I'm sure he taught them to count and things like that because you couldn't cheat one of them. They could count it ahead of you. And I'm sure he had to teach them things like that.
The last years of Samuel's life were marked by a physical and emotional decline, which is believed to be caused by a combination of factors, including the loss of many of his family members, his age, and his war injuries.
I think that the death of Samuel's wife and his oldest son, they came about a year and a half apart, were devastating to him. And I think that there's some evidence in this from his pension record. In one of the areas, it described him as having been breaking down for the past 15 years. Well, at the time that report was written, if you trace that back, it corresponds with the death of his oldest son and his wife. And his oldest son in particular went with him and did a lot of things with him, so he certainly was very close to him.
I think he went with him a lot because Grandpap was rather frail from his injuries. Grandpap had been to the store and he was carrying back a heavy ham to the house, and Tom had measles and shouldn't have gotten out, and it was raining, and because his dad was frail, he ran out to go help him bring the ham in the house, and he got pneumonia and he died.
I think he must have felt a great deal of guilt about the death of his son, because your son has died because he was helping you. I think would have been a tremendous burden for him to bear. My great-grandfather was a very poor man, and he had, certainly to stretch his means and resources in every way he possibly could. And even though his wife, he didn't have a headstone for his wife, he did have a headstone made for his son, and unfortunately, he apparently the engraver had misunderstood the date of birth and put 1883 on there when it was probably 1873. And he always said that if he could ever get enough money together, he would have that headstone changed, but he never did.
As we get older, as he was getting older, it seems that he was losing contact with what was normal, what was real. And so coining it as Alzheimer's is hard to say, but there was a mental debilitation that was seen there. So it was hard to say whether it was due to the fact that he was just getting older, or did any of these injuries have anything to do with it.
Failing health and an inability to earn a living forced him to move in with his youngest son and his family. In 1904, he filed the necessary paperwork to have his pension benefits restored. In spite of the severity of his condition and injuries, the government denied his claim for 2 years.
If this claimant was ever pensioned for wound of head, face, right arm, and side, it was an error. I do not see how we can restore him for a disability he never alleged, and thus perpetuate an error. J.B. Albright, Bureau of Pensions, 1905.
Finally, Texas Congressman Oscar Gillespie intervened and cut through miles of government red tape. Samuel's pension was renewed, and the $10 a month he received from the government would afford a degree of financial security during the last few years of his life. Early on the morning of August 4th, 1909, Samuel awakened his family, coughing.
And he kept on, and finally started coughing up blood. And finally he coughed up a piece of case shot or shrapnel from this wound that he took in the explosion in 1863. And he instinctively knew that he was going to die. He knew that he wasn't going to live. So he asked his family if they would move his bed outside so he could watch the sun come up one last time.
And he was looking to the east when he died. They took him out under a tree, and he was looking at the sunrise. It was just coming up.
And they were all standing there with him shortly after sunrise when he died.
Although the old house has long since disappeared, the tree still stands today as a quiet testament to an old soldier who died there 100 years ago. All that remains of him today are the stories, his military record, and the chuck box that he converted from an old Springfield rifle crate. While no photograph of Samuel or Anna Mitchell is known to have survived, computer-generated images based on descriptions found in the historical record suggest how they may have looked. Family members readily confess a strong sense of respect and admiration for the strength that their grandpap displayed throughout his life, but especially that August day on the mountaintop at Sewanee. Although Samuel was the last casualty of that tragic event, living some additional 46 years, he chose to live his life as anything but a victim. He may have been limited because of the injuries he sustained, but evidence suggests that he did not let this or any other adversity define his life.
I think he would want to be remembered as a survivor and not a victim, because I think that probably the most important thing that I know about him from his story is this man had an iron will to live. He wanted to live. I mean, there are other men who went through the same kinds of explosions and injuries that he did, and I realize that there's a lot of that that's not in any of our control, but I also know that you have to have the will to live, to want to live through something like that and to survive.
It could not have been easy, and a lesser person would have folded under that.
Yeah, I think so too.
And I don't see how the man survived all those years. He was a strong person.
After reading all this as a nurse, it's amazing what the will to live and just the inner person, how much they will overcome. Just being a human being myself, just looking at this, I don't know if I could do it. I think a man that survived this probably didn't think twice. Yes, he sustained these injuries. Yes, he probably did look different. But it didn't change that he did what he had to do and carry on as much of a normal life as he could, to get married, to continue to have a family, to provide for this family. So I don't think a man like this would want pity.
I think it's the most fascinating story I ever heard. He is fascinating.
I think he would be proud to know that we were remembering him at all.